Hey everybody, it's Professor Snart checking in for our English 1152 poetry class. So one of the things that I wanted to mention, I kind of forgot to mention this in my earlier announcement, although that was long enough as it was, is that this English class 1152 is called poetry, but it's kind of more meant to be poetry analysis as opposed to say like poetry creative writing. But it can be confusing because unless you know sort of like the breadth of courses we offer, it might not be immediately obvious. If you're interested in poetry writing or creative writing, we have a whole bunch of those courses too. And so the English poetry writing class, which I also teach, is it's 2252. Again, it could be a little bit confusing, but the numbers are supposed to sort of line up that way. Having said that, though, because I teach both the so-called analysis and the so-called creative writing class, sort of like because of my background and where I come from and the beliefs I have about how we can productively engage with reading poetry, how we can become better writers of poetry. If you were to take my 2252, the poetry writing class, you'd find that we do, in addition to lots of poetry writing, we do lots of poetry analysis too. We look at it in terms of craft, like how do these poets confront the challenge of creating character, of using imagery, of elements of style, rhyme, rhythm, meter, all that jazz. And so we learn a lot by reading or analyzing poetry, even in the creative writing class. The flip side, especially if you're maybe discovering what you feel like is a little bit too late, that you are looking to write more poetry, and here you are in a poetry analysis class, is that certainly we read and analyze poetry. That's kind of the fundamental core of our class. But we do so in what I hope you'll find are lots of creative ways, and we often have lots of opportunity to, throughout our class here, to actually do some poetry writing as well. Not as much as we might have in the 2252, more of the creative writing class, but there's certainly opportunities to be creative with the poetry that we're reading. So it's not like read these poems, write an essay, read these poems, write an essay, etc., etc. I don't feel like that's really challenging for people or very engaging. It's kind of boring on your end, it's tedious on my end, sort of a lose-lose proposition. And so certainly we bring our critical reading faculties to bear when we look at the poems that are assigned in our class. But what we do with those readings or how we engage them is meant to be much more than just sort of this analytical, interpretation. There's part of that, but we want to do some more creative things with it. So again, the 1152 more the analysis class, the 2252 more the creative writing class, but maybe because I'm doing both and where I come from, there's a lot of overlap, I would say, in how we treat poetry in both of those courses. So just sort of an FYI. If you're looking for the creative writing stuff, we have lots of great courses. Intro to creative writing, we have genre courses like poetry, fiction writing, creative nonfiction, writing for publication, a whole set of those kinds of courses if that's more what you're interested in. But hopefully you'll find, again, like I'm saying, lots of creative opportunity even in this course, despite the fact that it's not like a creative writing course per se. All right, so I'm going to jump into our due dates here. And it's Thursday when I'm recording this, which means we've passed the main due date for Unit 1. We now have replies to do, and again, part of what hopefully you're getting used to is how we sort of do our main work here, in this case building out our portfolio, just introducing ourselves, building that website, using the discussion board in Blackboard to post that URL so everyone can sort of access everyone's Google page, and then using the discussion board again to do replies. So there's no like reply mechanism or commenting feature that's built into the Google Sites web builder. So we're sort of coming back to Blackboard to use those tools to interact with one another, even though the main stuff that we're doing here is built outside of Blackboard, and then just posted in Blackboard. So again, you'll probably find that as you're finishing these up, you can certainly get into Unit 2 and start that main work. You'll have the replies here, and again, kind of getting into that rhythm of maybe a little crossover between whatever two units we happen to be in at the same time, like Units 1 here, but Unit 2 here. So I'm going to jump into Unit 2 and take a quick look. This is really more of our first content unit where we're really looking at some of the poetry analysis stuff, although again, hopefully you'll find it a good mix of like poetry analysis type stuff, but also opportunities to be creative and to really kind of engage with the work in your own individual way. Okay, unit objectives, almost all of them here. Little brief survey. I'm always interested to know like why people take a course like this. I've seen lots of answers already, but if you haven't done this, make sure you do it. And I would really encourage you to follow up. And maybe I might have even made a note, like in your grade from the first unit, where if you talked about, like on your webpage, for example, if you talked about being like an education major or being in some program, maybe at a different school, or this course is for transfer, etc., etc. I happen to be the chair, the English chair here at COD of Literature, Creative Writing, and Film, and one of the things that I and we are really interested in is more effective marketing to people who are in different programs at different schools. You know, it runs the gamut, but how our classes are feeding into or serving those particular audiences or populations, and how we could better market. So we sometimes wonder, you know, if we're not missing big groups of people who are in certain programs who could really benefit from taking our classes, you know, to serve those other programs, but they just don't know about it because we're not advertising or word of mouth hasn't spread or whatever. So do the survey, but again, please follow up with me if you feel like you know a group, like your program that you're in maybe. Maybe there's a graduate advisor or undergrad advisor that you know at a different school who could really benefit from like me sending our list of classes that we're teaching, English classes we're teaching every semester. I would love to hear that info, so please follow up if you could. All right, one of my favorite hip-hop artists, Mos Def. I'm not a hip-hop aficionado. I would not claim that at all. But our first reading, which you can find here, and you can watch the video. It's not really a video, but you can kind of listen to how the poetry, quote unquote, lays out in lyrical form here. This is an interesting choice for me because I actually ran into this particular song/poem, even though I'd known Mos Def's work before that, in a literature anthology. So it was presented to me, or I bumped into it first, really as poetry, and it kind of invites us to think about the crossover between lyrics and poetry. Are all lyrics poetry? Is all poetry potentially a lyric? Are there some really important differences between those two? Not something we have to think about now necessarily, but good to keep in the front of our minds as we go forward. All right, so Unit 2, couple things going on. This one we're going to use a shared slide deck, so you can see it embedded in Blackboard here. We have Andrea has jumped in and defined one thing for us already. But we're all going to be working in the same slide deck, so it might get a little bit messy. Just be careful not to obviously write over something somebody has already written. And we want to avoid duplicating across definitions too. And you'll notice that the spacing kind of looks weird across the pages. Again, that's okay. It's going to look a little messy, especially as more and more people start jumping in. So you can see it here, but make sure you follow this link to actually access the slide deck. And we're going to do pretty conventional sort of poetry analysis type of exercise, not centered on one particular poem, but we're going to do just some vocabulary stuff. So defining some terms, you'll see them already listed in the slide deck itself. Again, pretty standard terms that we're going to run into. You can respace things as you need to. Just don't, again, be careful that you're not deleting or somehow bumping things off the page. You can even add new slides if you need just more space to work if you want. So you're doing 2 definitions. Make sure that you flesh out the definition, so you explain the term. Make sure you provide examples. If you borrow or sort of use a source or multiple sources for finding your definition, which is totally reasonable, make sure that you provide those, kind of like cite your source. It doesn't need to be in MLA or any special format, but just make note of maybe websites that you borrowed from. And I really want to stress this. I wouldn't be surprised if, let's say for some of the more uncommon words, onomatopoeia, for example, that maybe you have to look that up. So then you're staring at a dictionary.com definition or wherever it comes from. Don't just cut and paste that definition. So I get that you're going to have to look some of these up. That's totally fine. But try to at least reword it, because in that rewording, or in that almost like sort of taking it and putting it into language that you would say to somebody, that you would explain, you're not just parroting a definition, which doesn't really like sink in for you necessarily, actually put it into your own words. So we don't want to see just like cut and paste from a source. We don't want to see a version of cut and paste where maybe you just change a word, but the sentence structure is basically the same. Really try to like almost like you were taking it from one language to another, right? Translating it almost from that dictionary terminology to your own terminology. Clearly there's going to be, like, you have to preserve the sense of the meaning because we want the definition, but really do your best to put it into your own terms. It's more useful, I think, for us learning the terminology, but mostly for you as the person who's doing those definitions to really like understand what that definition is. You're not just cutting, pasting, you're not just kind of finding some synonyms for words, you're really trying to put it into your own terms. That again is why it's really important to have some examples and to make sure you explain how the example shows how it's an example, like this works because it, and then fill in the blank. So again, this is not just an exercise in finding a source and more or less cutting and pasting it into our slide deck. We want to really have and develop some working definitions for these terms. Some of them, again, like I said, more maybe uncommon. Others, certainly terms that you'll recognize, like satire, for example. But sometimes it's actually those more common terms that we all sort of know them, quote unquote. But it's the act of really having to define it, finding examples, explaining the examples, that we come to a really full understanding of what that term actually means, okay? So again, jumping into the slide deck, doing the definitions, make sure you're really sort of investing some time in this. And because we're all working in this one slide deck, what we'll have at the end of it is a really, really great built-out set of slides here that have all kinds of terms. Like there's lots of slides. I think there's like 11, 12, I don't know what there are right now, 16 maybe. And we might even have more as people maybe add new slides to build out definitions so they're not working in really cramped spaces here. All right, so that's one activity that we're working on for this unit. The other one, which I really like, and there's kind of a lot of explanation here, I'll let you read that on your own. The short version is we're going to use a tool called Padlet. So you're going to go to this web address on your phone, so open up Chrome or whatever browser exists on your smartphone, and this is designed to be a mobile assignment. You don't sit down at the computer and do it, you don't Google a picture, you're finding images of how poetry exists pretty much in your everyday real world life. You're not pulling a book off the shelf, we know that poetry exists there. You're not finding something that's just poetic, and I'm making the air quotes here, like people holding hands, or oh, that's a beautiful thing, or this, that, or the other, or here's a picture of my, family that I really love. Okay, all true maybe, but that's not poetry. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about actual words in space. And in fact, Andrea has jumped in here and provided us with a really great example. So we can see here something that she might encounter in her everyday life. She grabs a picture of it, uses her phone to post to our Padlet here. You'll see other people's posts sort of populate on our digital corkboard. You can think of it that way. And you can see that it's literally words on a, not exactly page, but right, they're words being used in a space like poetry. And it's clearly designed to be poetry. There's sort of like line breaks and indent, and there's different stanzas here, right? It's not just prose, like words run together in a big paragraph. The space of the page, the white space, actually matters for the kind of mood that's being communicated here. Again, she, I'm assuming, runs into it just sort of in her everyday life. It's kind of an everyday thing. You don't necessarily have to seek it out. You just have to like train your eye to be aware of it. And it's clearly text, right? It's poetry. It's not metaphorically poetic. It is literally poetry. And so it's the point of the assignment is precisely to find this thing, poetry, which seems so kind of marginal in some ways. And yet if we start to look for it, it's like everywhere. It really is everywhere. And I bet once we see more posts come in, you'll realize, oh my gosh, it's like in things that we buy or use, it's in public spaces, it's all over the place, even though we don't necessarily notice that. And if you ask the average person, like, do you read poetry? Probably they're going to say no, even if they think it's kind of a cool thing. the answer is, like most people, no, I don't really read poetry, or I don't have time, or I don't seek it out, and yet we're surrounded by it all the time. That's what I want us to discover. All right, so quick little thing back here. So this is meant to be a mobile assignment, right? You should be doing it kind of all the time, almost. Back here, in addition to defining your terms on the slide deck, I want you to jump into the Blackboard discussion board and just create a new post where you just say what terms you defined. You can cut and paste your definition if you want, but you don't really have to. Your initial post is just a good way to facilitate the reply component, which we're going to do. It would be really messy if we did it in here, in the actual slide deck itself. But what I want you to do is, I'm trying to find it here. Make sure that here it is, that you reply, not on the slide deck itself, but reply to two people's posts about the terms that they defined. So you're going to look at their definition on the slide deck, but you're going to use the Blackboard discussion board tool to reply. And again, maybe it's like terms that you kind of knew but didn't have good examples of. Maybe it's terms that you had no idea about at all. Maybe it's terms that you sort of knew, or maybe that you thought you knew but actually didn't quite know as correctly as possible, or as you thought. So again, sort of a mix of the Google tool so we can all collaborate in one space, but also the Blackboard discussion tool so we can have some back and forth between classmates here. Last but not least, as we go building out your portfolio, reposting that link, again, just a good place to keep the stuff that we're doing so people's portfolio reflects the unit by unit work that we're doing. Remember to publish, right? So it's kind of up to date or updated. And notice that there's no reply component built into this. This is just about you keeping your portfolio up to date as we go through our various units here, okay? So a little more intensive unit here, much more focused on our course content, various things to do. Survey won't take you that long. Again, reach out to me directly if you have some ideas about marketing our classes. Our definitions, using both the shared slide deck and also the discussion board here to have some reply back and forth. And then the Poetry Padlet tool, you can read the directions a little more carefully, but we actually have a really good example on the Padlet already for how this is supposed to work. All right? So hopefully you are settling into the class, getting used to our due date structure, sort of how the units are laid out and how the pieces fit together. I'll be back in touch in a few days here, and definitely reach out to me if you have any questions, concerns, or anything, especially tech-wise, going on as we get underway with our course.